It is the fourth night of rain. You are awake because the sound changed. Not the rain, the fire. An hour ago, it was a steady breathing sound, low and constant. Now it is intermittent, a hiss, a pause, a hiss. You do not need to look to know what that means. You look anyway. The center is still red, a dull red, the color of an ember rather than a flame. Around it, everything is black and wet. The wood you laid on before sleeping has not caught. It has steamed. You lift it away, and the underside comes up slick and cold. There is no flame left to lose. There is only heat, and heat leaves faster than anything. You have perhaps 20 minutes, maybe less, if the wind turns. Everyone else is asleep. You could wake them. 6 pairs of hands instead of 2. But 6 people breathing over a dying fire is 6 people in the way. So you do it alone, the way it is usually done. You lean in until your face is close enough to feel the last of it. And you start looking for something dry. In a landscape where nothing has been dry for 4 days. This is the problem, not the cold, not the hunger, not the animals. This. A group of people, somewhere in Ice Age Europe, standing over a red glow at 2 in the morning, trying to keep it alive until dawn. We know they solved it because we are here. What we do not have is a written record of how. What we have instead is ash, layers of it, in caves and rock shelters across Europe and Asia, sometimes dozens of layers thick. Each layer is a fire that was kept, and in between them occasionally a gap. A gap is a fire that was not. It is easy to think of fire as comfort, warmth, light, something to sit around. For most of human history, it was closer to equipment. Start with the obvious one, heat. A human body at rest produces roughly as much heat as a bright light bulb. That is enough to keep you alive in mild conditions and nowhere near enough below freezing. Clothing helps. Shelter helps. Neither generates anything. Fire is the only thing in that landscape that makes heat instead of merely trapping it. Now, the less obvious one. Food. Cooking does something specific and measurable. It breaks down starch and protein before your body has to. The same meal, cooked, releases significantly more usable energy than raw. You get more out of less. For a population living close to the edge of its calorie budget, that is not a luxury. There is a physical consequence visible in the fossil record. Human jaws and teeth get smaller over time. Guts get shorter. Those are the changes you would expect in an animal that stopped doing so much of its digestion internally. The timing and the cause are still argued about. The direction is not. Then there is what fire does to the dark. A fire extends the usable day. Everything that requires close work, repairing a tool, sewing a hide, teaching a child how a blade is struck, becomes possible after sunset. In a northern winter, sunset is most of the day, and there is the part that leaves no trace at all. A fire is a place people face. It puts a group in a circle, looking inward, for hours, every night, for their entire lives. Whatever human culture is, a great deal of it was assembled sitting around one. So when the fire goes out in the rain, the loss is not one thing. It is heat and food and light and the hours in which a group is a group. All of it at once, in the middle of the night. Rain does not put out a fire by drowning it. It is far more efficient than that. Water does 3 separate things, and each one is enough on its own. The first is stealing heat. Turning water into steam takes an enormous amount of energy. Every drop that lands has to be boiled away before the fire can get on with burning. A steady drizzle can absorb heat as fast as the fire makes it. The flame does not go out, it just stops winning. The second is the fuel. Wood does not need to be soaked to be useless, it only needs to be damp. Water in the wood must be driven off before the wood itself can reach ignition temperature. Damp wood spends its first minutes on the fire, cooling the fire down. That is what the hiss is. That is the sound of your fire being spent on water. The third is the air. A fire needs moving air. Rain comes with wind and with wet ground, and wet ground gives off cold, heavy air that sits low. Put those together and the flame is being cooled from below while it is being drenched from above. Now add the detail that matters most and is easiest to overlook. Rain in the Ice Age was not a summer shower. Across much of the period, the north was cold and dry, but the transitions were not. Warmer intervals brought long, unstable stretches, days of rain, sleet, freezing fog, thaw, and refreeze. Those are the conditions that kill a fire and the conditions in which people most needed it. Deep cold is survivable if you are dry. Wet at 3 degrees above freezing is what takes people apart. So, the fire problem and the survival problem arrive together, on the same night, in the same weather. That is not coincidence. That is the whole difficulty. The first answer is the obvious one. Put something over it. The obvious answer is also the one that kills you. A fire needs to breathe, enclose it, and the smoke has nowhere to go, and neither does the carbon monoxide. Cover it too tightly, and you have solved the rain by inventing a worse problem. So the roof cannot be a lid, it has to be a shelf. Look at where the hearths actually are. In cave sites across Europe, hearths cluster near the entrance and under the overhang. Not deep inside, where the air is still and the smoke would gather. Not outside, where the weather is. In the band between them, where there is stone above and open air in front. That band is the single most valuable real estate in the Paleolithic. It is dry, it is ventilated, and it faces out so you can see what is coming. Where there was no cave, people built the same relationship from scratch. At open-air sites, we find hearths with post holes or stone arrangements around them. Something stood over that fire. We rarely know exactly what. The most likely answer is the simplest one. A lean-to, a sloping surface, open on one side, angled to shed water away from the fire and let smoke out the front. Hides would work. Bark would work. Turf over a frame would work. None of those survive well, which is why the evidence is mostly the hole where a post stood. There is a second trick, and it shows up again and again. Dig the fire down. A hearth set into a shallow pit is protected from wind at ground level, holds heat in the surrounding earth, and keeps burning fuel from being scattered. Some are lined with stones, which store heat and go on radiating it long after the flames drop. You can see the logic without being told it. The fire is not just being sheltered, it is being built into the ground so the ground helps. Now, the harder problem. Even with a roof, you need something to burn, and everything outside is soaked. The solution is not to find dry wood, it is to understand where dryness hides. Start with standing dead wood. A dead branch still attached to a tree off the ground has not been sitting in mud. Its outside is wet. Its inside, very often, is not. Ground wood is the opposite. It has been lying in water, and it has been rotting, and rot means it will not burn hot, even when dried. So the rule is simple, and it is the same rule any woodsman would give you today. Take it standing, not lying, then split it. The wet part of a branch is a shell. Break through it and the core is dry. A stone blade and something to hammer with turns a useless wet stick into a handful of dry splinters. This is not speculation about what they could have done. Splitting is what the tools are for. Then there is the fuel that does not care about rain at all. Fat. Bone is not just what is left after a meal. Bone is full of grease, and grease burns. At sites across the Ice Age North, we find hearths packed with burnt bone fragments in quantities that make no sense as rubbish. Bone burns poorly on its own. It needs a wood fire under it to get going. But once it is going, it burns hot, and it burns long, and it does not need a forest. On the open steppe, where trees were scarce and weather was brutal, bone may not have been a supplement. It may have been the main fuel. And there is one more, easy to forget because it is unglamorous: dung. Dried animal dung burns clean and slow and is available wherever there are herds. Herders across the world still use it. There is no reason to think people surrounded by mammoth, bison, and horse did not. Put all of that together and the picture changes. They were not looking for dry wood in the rain. They were carrying a system, split what stands, keep a store under cover, burn fat and bone when the wood fails. The rain does not defeat that. It only makes it expensive. There is an assumption worth removing before we go further, that every fire was started from scratch. Almost certainly, most were not. Starting a fire is work, keeping one is less work, and moving one is less work than either. An ember does not need flame to stay alive. It needs three things: fuel, a little air, and insulation. Give it those and it will hold for hours. Pack a glowing coal in dry punk wood or dried fungus, wrap it in bark or hide, leave a gap for air, and it becomes portable. Too much air and it burns out. Too little and it suffocates. The skill is in the gap. People recorded doing exactly this span every inhabited continent. Bark containers, horn containers, smoldering tinder bundles, slow-burning fungus carried on a strap. That is ethnography, not archaeology, and the distinction matters. Ember carriers are made of bark and hide and fungus. Those do not survive 15,000 years in the ground. So we cannot point at a Paleolithic fire-carrying kit and say, here it is. What we can say is that the technique needs no metal, no ceramics, no invention we would recognize. It needs a coal and something to wrap it in. And there is a strong indirect argument. If you have ever tried to start a fire by friction in wet conditions, you know why people would bother. It is not that it cannot be done. It is that it is slow, exhausting, and unreliable exactly when you are cold and your hands are numb and the tinder is damp. Nobody who had a working ember would choose to start over. So, picture the group moving in bad weather. Somebody is carrying the fire, not metaphorically, physically, in a bundle, checked and fed at intervals, the way you would carry water. It is one of the oldest jobs there is, and we have no idea what they called it. Sometimes the ember dies anyway. Then you are in the situation this whole video is about: cold, wet, dark, and starting from zero. There are two ways to make fire without fire, and both are attested in the record. The first is friction. Wood against wood, fast enough and hard enough that the dust it grinds off begins to glow. It is not the friction that lights, it is the powder. You are manufacturing a tiny pile of hot dust and then giving it air. Everything about this method hates water. Damp wood will not produce dry dust. Damp dust will not hold heat. Damp tinder will not take the coal. In steady rain, friction is close to hopeless without cover and dry stock you prepared earlier, which tells you something. The preparation is the method. The rubbing is just the last step. The second way is percussion. Strike the right stone against iron pyrites and you throw a spark. Not flint against flint. That mostly gives you dust and frustration. Flint or a similar hard stone against a mineral containing iron so that a fragment shears off hot enough to ignite. This is not theory. Lumps of pyrites with clear wear from repeated striking have been found at Paleolithic sites, sometimes alongside the stone that struck them. That is about as close to a fire kit as the record gives us, and percussion has a decisive advantage in rain. It is fast. A spark takes an instant, not 10 minutes of sustained effort. You still need dry tinder, but you need it for seconds rather than for as long as your arms hold out. So, the honest picture is layered. You keep an ember because starting over is expensive. If the ember dies, you strike a spark. If you have the stones and dry tinder. If you have neither, you work friction under whatever cover you can build, and you may not succeed tonight. And the thing that decides which of those you are doing is not skill. It is whether 3 days ago, when it was dry, somebody thought to put tinder away. Here, we have to be careful, because this is where storytelling usually replaces evidence. You will often hear that one person, usually an elder, was the keeper of the flame. It is a good image. There is no direct evidence for it. What the archaeology gives us is different and in some ways more interesting. It gives us repetition. At many long-occupied sites, hearths are rebuilt in the same place again and again across layers that represent long spans of time. Same spot, same construction, sometimes the same stone lining, relaid. That is not one person's habit. That is a practice being transmitted. Somebody taught somebody else where the fire goes and how it is built. We can also say something about attention. A fire that is kept overnight has to be fed at intervals, not constantly, but reliably. That means somebody was awake, or somebody woke. A group of people sleeping in shifts around a fire is one of the plainest inferences we can make from a hearth that stayed lit. And we can say something about children. Fire is dangerous and it is essential, which makes it exactly the kind of thing a society has to teach early and teach well. Every group in the ethnographic record that lives with open fire has rules about it that children learn before they can hunt. There is no reason to think that started recently. So, the honest version is not the lone keeper of the flame. It is duller and larger. Everybody knew. Everybody was responsible. Somebody was awake. And it worked night after night for tens of thousands of years, well enough that we exist. Now, the part nobody likes to think about. Sometimes it did not work. We should be careful here too, because the archaeology of a fire that went out is mostly the archaeology of nothing. But we can reason about consequences. Losing fire on a mild night is an inconvenience. Losing it on a wet night near freezing is a different order of problem. Wet clothing does not dry. Wet people lose heat several times faster than dry ones. Hypothermia does not announce itself. It arrives as clumsiness and confusion, which are precisely the states in which you fail to fix the thing that is killing you. That is the trap. The colder you get, the worse you are at solving cold. So the group has a choice, and neither option is good. Stay and try to rebuild in bad conditions, or move and try to reach a neighboring group who has fire. The second one tells us something easy to miss. Fire is a reason to have neighbors, a group that knows where other people are and is on terms that allow it to arrive at their fire at night, is a group with a backup. Isolation is not romantic in this world. Isolation is a single point of failure. And this may be part of why we find evidence of contact between groups over long distances, materials moving hundreds of kilometers, techniques appearing in more than one place. Some of that is trade, some of it is marriage, some of it probably is the simple fact that people who might one day need each other's fire stay in touch. Let us separate what we know from what we have been reconstructing. What we know because it is physically there. Hearths, thousands of them across Europe, Asia, and Africa, spanning hundreds of thousands of years. Repeated hearths in the same location, layer over layer, stone linings and shallow pits, built deliberately. Burnt bone in quantities that indicate fuel, not refuse. Pyrites showing wear from repeated striking, sometimes with the stone that struck them. That is the solid ground. What we are inferring, reasonably but without direct proof, that embers were carried. The technique is simple, the materials do not survive. And the ethnographic parallel is universal, that shelters were built over fires at open-air sites. We have the post holes, we do not have the roofs. That fuel was gathered and stored ahead of bad weather. It is what the physics demands, but a woodpile leaves little trace. And what we do not know at all, whether any particular group ever lost fire permanently, who tended it in any specific case, what they thought they were doing beyond staying warm, whether it had a name, a rule, a story attached. That last part is genuinely gone. But here is what survives, and it is not nothing. Go into a cave that people used for thousands of years and dig, and you find the fires stacked one above another. Ash, then occupation debris, then ash again. Each of those layers is a night that somebody got right. Not a discovery, not an invention, just a night in the rain when the fire was nearly out and somebody found something dry. They did it often enough, and for long enough, that the habit outlasted the species that started it. That is the record. Everything else, including most of what you have just watched me reconstruct, is us reading ash and trying to imagine the people who made it.